Welcome to the reality show, day 27 of the war in Israel. We are now going to talk about this idea of a humanitarian pause that we've heard. You hear more and more voices uh, uh, requesting, demanding, and now the latest voice added to that mix is the U.S. President Joe Biden, who, when he talks, people listen, and unfortunately, Israel listens a bit too much to what Joe Biden has to say. I'm going to hope that he's not going to have an impact here because we need to try to understand what that means and what does it mean to fight a war, and how this would fit into that. I'm joined today by Anders Ingemarsson, Morgan Carter, Michael Liebowitz. Thank you all for joining me. Anders, what do you think of this idea of a humanitarian pause, which is, I think the way Joe Biden justified it or rationalized it is it'll give an opportunity, for the hostages to be released, which is as salesmanship, it sounds like kind of like the stereotypical used car salesman kind of nonsense that people try to put one over on you with.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's a very bad idea, obviously, and yeah, it's a shame that the president couldn't stand up to one heckler. If I understand it, that's what happened. Now, I don't. Yeah, I actually had to go on and look up humanitarianism, and one definition I found was the doctrine that people's duty is to promote human welfare. And I could probably add to that, no questions asked, regardless of context, basically as a moral imperative, right? And so I have no problem with humanitarian aid to Israel right now. But to anything in Gaza, no, no. And there is already too much of it. We keep forgetting, or people don't realize that all of this is on Hamas. The only humanitarian response in this situation would be for Hamas to unconditionally surrender, lay down their weapons, and that would save a lot of lives and casualties among civilians, if that is what you're concerned about.
Yeah, all this is on Hamas, and also all of Gaza is controlled by Hamas. A little bit less now when Israel is there in some parts of it, but generally when aid goes in, it goes to Hamas. Hamas decides what happens with it. Morgan, your thoughts on this idea of humanitarian aid and a humanitarian pause, which is basically means that Israel will stop fighting terrorists temporarily so that aid can be distributed or something to that effect?
Yeah. It was disappointing in a way, and in a way entirely expected. I think anyone who's aware of how the conflict between Israel and Hamas has gone in the past should have expected the American president to decline in his kind of holding to moral principles after a certain point in time. So Biden's been fairly impressive in his rhetoric so far about defending Israel. We've spoken about that on the show, but eventually, history bear out that he was going to give in to some extent. He's not given in fully, but the way he's trying to rationalize this idea of the humanitarian pause is really embarrassing, really. He said, that a ceasefire would be to enable Hamas, would be to advantage Hamas. And we don't want to do that because Israel should be able to defend itself. But a humanitarian pause is a different thing. And that just clearly isn't true. Even if you would like to help civilians or people in Gaza, very clearly a cessation of hostilities allows Hamas to regroup, to organize, and to get some of that aid. So I think it's very silly to do that. I think he should be honest if he's going to advocate for this kind of thing and say, yeah, we know Hamas is going to benefit, but we care more about the civilians. He should just openly state that if that's what he's going to advocate. And I have some more things to say, but that's my kind of opening thoughts on it.
Michael, your thoughts on this idea and on the U.S. president's support of it, and maybe also on the fact that in Israel they say this war is going to last months, maybe years, and Israel is losing support by the minute in different forms. What do you think of this, and where is this going?
Well, as far as the president goes, I mean, he's a politician, so he's going to try to straddle whatever fence he can that's going to maximize his support. Unfortunately, it's politicians that make decisions for everybody else. But I am at a loss to understand what is the difference between a ceasefire and a humanitarian pause. I don't get it. But more, I guess, broadly, I don't recall these types of things ever happening to when another country is attacked. I don't hear the world calling for that country to show restraint or we got to get humanitarian aid to the enemy. It always seems to be when it's Israel that gets hit, everybody comes down and it's like as if Israel did something wrong by getting attacked. The other day I saw something on, I don't know, one of the social medias, and it was talking about all the places in the world where there's humanitarian crises going on. With the Chinese, I can't pronounce it, but I think they're Muslims. They begins with an H. I can't pronounce it. But you don't hear an awful lot about that. In Yemen, we've had this war going on for who knows how long. You don't hear much about that. But when it's Israel, all of a sudden you have to get food and shelter to everybody involved, and Israel has to be careful. And it's maddening. I'm not one that likes to throw around terms like racism and anti-Semitism. It's oftentimes just an easy method to try to win an argument when you don't have facts. But it's hard not to think that some anti-Semitism is in play here, given how many people are just speak out against Israel.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with terms like racist is too many people use it to mean things that are not racist but yeah, that doesn't invalidate the concept. There was also this idea you should never compare anything to the Nazis because you lose an argument. No, some things deserve to be compared to the Nazis, and I think in this instance we have an enemy that is very similar to the Nazis in their methods and in their goals, if not in their capabilities. Luckily for the rest of us, and not just in Israel, as I always say, everywhere in the world, this enemy is here and it's coming for all of us. I do have to say, the idea. So I remember after 9/11, Tony Blair was one of the first leaders. I was living in Israel at the time, but I was actually visiting London, and Tony Blair was one of the first to visit George W. Bush, and he also was talking about a proportionate response. And when the U.S. finally, chose the easiest target they could, the first thing they dropped on them was food and medicine. So, this is unfortunately a thing in the West. I think Israel is more of Israel gets these demands are made of Israel more than they are of others, but this unfortunately is how the West fights, and Afghanistan is a good example because you can see where that ended up. When you treat an enemy as not an enemy. I want to just quickly, I look back at the history of ceasefires. They weren't humanitarian pauses, but ceasefires in the last 20 years. Whenever Israel has another round of fighting, which always starts the same way. Hamas, fires rockets. Once they kidnapped a few people, and then Israel starts responding, and then the world is it's kind of not okay with it at the beginning, and then gets very angry, and then people demand a ceasefire, and then Israel says yes, and then finally Israel and Hamas agree to a ceasefire, and then Hamas violates it, and then Israel fights back. And then there's another ceasefire, and then usually there's a few of them until it finally happens. But Hamas does this, to show who's the boss there, I think, and Israel seems to comply with that. Is there any reason to think that a humanitarian pause right now would actually mean that Israeli soldiers in Gaza sit in their tanks or wherever, and wait it out, and Hamas will do the same. Anders.
Well, I mean, it obviously increases the risk for Israeli soldiers to the extent that Hamas is able to regroup or reinforce or whatever it is that they're doing. So there's no doubt about that. I mean, and probably, I mean, a lot of damage has probably already been done by the fact that it has taken as long as it has to get in there. Now, I'm sure that some of it was part of that Israel was caught unprepared and needed the time, but I think there is a lot of delay based on the international pressure that we see from the US and every other Western country, unfortunately. So yeah, no, I think we'll see more casualties among Israeli soldiers for every ceasefire, every pause to deliver humanitarian aid. And I think Mike's point there, I mean, what's the difference? Ceasefire or humanitarian pause? Is humanitarian pause now the new term we're going to use for a ceasefire? You know, terms evolve. And so, yeah, no, I every minute of this is to the detriment of Israel.
Morgan, we've said on this channel, Israel seems to care more about the PR war than the actual war. Israel really cares what world leaders think, which is, to some extent understandable, and what the media, how the media reports it, which is to a lesser extent understandable. If there's a humanitarian pause that Israel unilaterally says, yeah, we're stopping, bring in whatever the innocent civilians need, and have the Hamas-run UN agency in Gaza distribute it. So there's a pause, and then Hamas starts. Hamas violates that pause. Is that gonna help Israel in the PR? People protesting from the river to the sea in the streets gonna change their mind and side with Israel?
No.
We only ask the hard-hitting questions here, as you see it.
No, they're not. I think obviously not, because they aren't actually against Israel and they aren't in favor of Palestine for rational reasons. They aren't honest. I don't think most of them are honestly confused about who's the innocent party and who's the aggressor. There was interesting debate just a few days ago at the Oxford Union with Ben Shapiro, who I don't generally approve of, but he went there and obviously was questioned a lot by the students about Israel and Palestine. And the way those debates happen is he stands at the dispatch box and students go up and stand in front of him and ask him questions. And every single one of them, he asked them, do you want, are you in favor of allowing Israel's continued existence, or do you want it to be pushed into the river? And none of them could answer that they didn't. And all of them had to come up with these rationalizations about why they aren't in favor of genocide, but they do want the destruction of Israel, and so on and so forth. So no, I don't think that's going to change their minds. And of course, there's nothing actually humanitarian about this. I think humanitarianism is a kind of vague idea, but it's an understandable kind of perspective if what it means is you think it's a tragedy that human life is being extinguished. From anyone who values life, I think that's an understandable kind of response to war, because war is a terrible thing. We shouldn't be flippant or gleeful or bloodthirsty about that. And part of the reason why it's terrible is not just because it's terrible for the Israelis, it's terrible for the innocent or good people in Palestine. There's something to be said about, there are people in Palestine who are non-combatants who are just as guilty as the soldiers, but there are some who are children who will generally be caught up in it. But the humanitarian thing is not to prolong the conflict, it's to get it over swiftly and decisively and as quickly as possible. And that's why perhaps some people, young people, might be confused about the idea of a humanitarian pause, which just means a temporary ceasefire rather than a permanent one. But anyone, like someone in Joe Biden's position, who's a politician, who's in the highest office in the world, who kind of has to think about these things, maybe I'm giving him too much credit, he knows what's actually going to lead to the cessation of suffering in this situation. And it's not prolonging the combat. It's not giving credence to Hamas. It's not giving them aid. So, for example, today, I think it was 400 citizens were allowed out of Palestine. if they held a foreign passport. I think that's very understandable to do. I think it's a strategic question as to whether Israel should or should not have done that, whether it's actually, if they were accidentally going to let out some Hamas fighters, if they could actually filter those people out, because you don't want to keep foreign nationals trapped in there, and you want to, and foreign governments would presumably putting pressure on them to get their citizens out. I think that's understandable, and that's a strategic matter. But if you let a kind of vague notion of humanitarianism mean that you're a pacifist and you just want a cessation to all the violence, unfortunately, actually, what you're actually doing in that case is you're in favor of continued violence. So there you go.
Yeah, nobody was checking the passports of the tens of thousands of people who flooded central London in support of Gaza and Hamas on Saturday, but I guarantee you many of them are British nationals. The idea of letting foreign nationals out without checking, and again, they go out to Egypt. Israel is nowhere to be seen. Just like when the humanitarian aid goes in, Israel is not there checking it. I don't think anybody's checking it at this point. Of course, there are Hamas people with with foreign passports, without a doubt. And if they allow 400 people out, the first 400 will be Hamas operatives who can go out, and who knows what they will do and what they will plan. Michael.
No question. Do you just want me to opine into the
Well,
open air?
actually, so I can ask a question. There's one type of aid that is particularly worrying to me, which is fuel. Now, Israel is refusing to give them fuel. I've jokingly said on Twitter that this is where I am with the environmentalists. Let's use Gaza as the first place where we completely stop using fossil fuels and see how that works. I fully support right now. But yeah, the idea of the tunnels where Hamas, which is Hamas city, basically underneath Gaza, you need fuel to power them, to have light, to have whatever it is that goes on in there. Hamas needs this fuel, and whatever is lacking for the rest of Gaza, the civilian population, Hamas is not lacking, and Hamas will be the first and the last to use fuel. So Israel is already kind of first said no, absolutely no fuel can enter the Gaza Strip. Now they're not as decisive about it. Is Israel's resolve kind of being broken on this, and is the West also while the other side is clearly has the resolve and knows what they're fighting for, and will continue to fight, is the West basically slowly giving up?
Yes. The short answer is yes. I think Israel has already largely lost the resolve. I don't think they're going to do what they said they were going to do at the beginning, which is to eliminate Hamas. I'm really not optimistic. This, and it's not just this. I mean, from a personal perspective, the lack of rational discourse in this world is just maddening. Everywhere from social media to the news, whatever. In my view, Israel, and we've talked about this, Razi, I think Israel needs to eviscerate Hamas. I think they should do so with as few civilian casualties as possible. But don't forget, the goal is to get rid of Hamas. The goal is not to spare civilians. I think you should do it where possible, but you got to get rid of Hamas. And I just don't see that as going to happen. And this whole idea that you have to give aid, and I don't know how it gets to this. I don't know how it gets to the point. I mean, I saw a guy on social media this morning, and it's a presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party, and he's citing scripture as a means of saying that Israel isn't entitled to the land. And I responded, I said, should we really be citing a 2,000-year-old work of fiction to solve modern political arguments? I mean, but that's what it comes to. And it seems to, it only comes to that again when it comes to Israel. When it comes to Israel, everybody looks for the reason that they shouldn't have the land. You want to find out about, I read an article this morning about settlers in the West Bank, and they're saying that they're not acting appropriately, and they're, bullying the Palestinians in the West Bank. And I don't know anything about that situation. What I do know is that Hamas terrorists entered Israel and butchered people, and there needs to be a response. And bringing in ancillary information and the idea that we need to be humanitarian, and I consider myself a humanitarian. Like I said, spare the civilians where you can, but you have to get rid of Hamas. And I don't think they're going to do that. I don't see any evidence that they're going to do that. I hope I'm wrong.
Well, I agree with most of that. The spare the civilians where you can. Again, like if this means spending an additional second or minute figuring out, who is where, when a terrorist, you know where a terrorist is, or where where weapons are, or whatever it is that you have to target, and that extra second might be enough for them to get away. No, I would.
I don't disagree, Razi. What I mean, and it's a hypothetical I'm going to give you, is if you know that there's civilians in an area where there's terrorists, and 5 minutes from now those civilians are going to be gone, and in that interval the enemy is not going to have an opportunity to attack you. You wait the 5 minutes and then kill. That's all I mean, is that when it's possible, I'm not saying they should go out of their way and make things difficult on themselves. The object is to win war. But if it can be avoided, I think that you should avoid killing children.
I don't think I would wait that 5 minutes.
Well, there we differ.
Yeah.
Maybe we should come to blows over it. I don't know.
I'm still waiting for some, all caps support from James Valiant in the chat.
You're going to get it, I'm sure.
But yesterday I heard on Israeli television somebody say, because they estimate something like 50,000 armed terrorists in Gaza, and somebody said, if you wanted to kill 50,000, you should have done it on day one, and you would have had support. I don't think that's true. I don't think the world would have supported it, but it certainly wouldn't have been as difficult on October 7th as it is now. James Valiant in all caps. Razi is right. 2 exclamation marks. I'll take. I was going for 3, but I'll take it.
Well, I guess we now know that James and Razi are both wrong, obviously.
Anders, do you want to settle this and tell us who is the right?
Yeah,
would you wait the extra 5 minutes?
I think Mike's example is hypothetical, because Hamas will be out in 4 minutes before the kids got out after 5. So, so I'm with you, Razi.
Any other thoughts on especially like the idea of letting fuel in? I mean, it's within the wider scope of humanitarian aid, which I think maybe we should not allow in generally, but
no, fuel doesn't matter what it is. Fuel, medicine, food, and I hear that they're complaining that the cell phone service and internet service is not working. Well, I mean, give me a break. Shut it all down if it's not already. As my wife said when I told her about today's topic, that and she's from Germany, and she said the U.S. we didn't drop any food packages until they had unconditionally surrendered, and I doubt that we gave the Japanese anything before the atomic bombs were dropped and the emperor had given up. So I mean that's the only valid approach, only moral.
Yeah. Actually, I had something to say about some of that. I don't remember what it was, and I do have to leave in 4 minutes, so I'm going to go to Morgan quickly, and I'm going to try to remember what I had to say.
I guess just to weigh in on the civilians point, because I think this is an important consideration. Although I think broadly in principle we're all agreeing, if in a particular instance we might still apply that principle differently. Like, so what you said, Michael, like I don't disagree. Like, I don't think we should be gratuitous about wanting to kill civilians. And occasionally, rhetorically, I hear some objectivists say things where I think kind of like you're too gleeful about like including civilians in the line of fire. But for example, like the Afghanistan war, where there was much more space, the battlefield, and there is something I want to talk about at one point. There is no such thing as a battlefield, really. People have this idea that battle takes place on an open plain where you can easily distinguish the combatants from civilians, and that just isn't true. That's never been true in the history of war ever, but particularly not in modern war, and particularly not in Gaza. But in the Afghanistan war, combatants would take their families around with them in the jeeps, knowing that the Americans wouldn't blow up the jeeps because they had the families inside, and that's a just truly disgusting thing. But we know how Hamas acts, and Hamas, like, so you said, like, within the 5 minutes, like, we should wait that, and like, I kind of agree with that, but I guess I agree with Anders that they wouldn't let the kids leave; they would keep them there. So whilst I kind of agree broadly with you, I just think it's never going to arise where you could even get to the situation, really, where the civilians are going to be able to get out of the way.
Michael, no question, because we were responding to your.
Okay. I just didn't want to jump in. Okay, I don't disagree. I gave a hypothetical, and I said if this were the case. I'm not saying it ever would be, but that's the nature of hypotheticals: is you have to construct a scenario where it would be the case. But I would push back a little bit on the idea that you can never distinguish, because if you can just never distinguish civilians and children from Hamas, well, then just nuke the place. You know what I mean? Just wipe out everything. And you might not literally with a nuclear weapon. I'm just saying literally get rid of every living thing on the planet. And in Gaza, and then move on. But I wouldn't recommend that. I don't think you would recommend it, Morgan. Maybe Razi. I don't know. But no, seriously, I think when you can spare children, you spare children. I like you said, I'm just not gleeful about killing people. It's a necessity at times, and especially in a situation like this, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be, I don't know if regretted is the word, maybe mourned is the word, that children are dying. And it's not their fault that they're dying. It's the fault of these butchers that happen to run the strip of land that they were born on. And that's a sad thing. And if I had the opportunity and I can spare that kid or those kids, I would do it. And I'm just saying Israel can too. If it's a situation where they can't, well, then it doesn't arise. The consideration doesn't come into view. But when it does, you spare people.
So on the Daily Objective, right before this show, Jonathan and I were talking about what I consider the collateral damage, or well, they're not civilians, but the innocents who are dying in war, and that is the 19 Israeli soldiers who died over the last couple of days, who should not have died. So if you give me the choice of a war that Hamas not just started and definitely didn't start on October 7th, like this is the only goal of their existence, and they are supported by the local population, of flattening Gaza or having Israeli soldiers die to protect so-called innocents in Gaza. Again, there are innocents in Gaza, the children, but they are the victims of Hamas. This is this is something that I definitely want Israel to win with as few casualties on the Israeli side as possible. Last year, I was speaking in a panel in an event in London, panel about football or soccer, the politics of it, not the game itself. And somebody in the audience made some weird comment, and then I was waiting to answer, but he left right away. I also have to leave right now. So,
at least you didn't make a weird comment.
Well, I said I would flatten Gaza. That's what I'm gonna leave you guys with. The London Ayn Rand meetup starts in less than 30 minutes. I have to run that. So we are talking, of course, about the same topic that we're talking about here. So I'm going to take my humanitarian pause and leave you to it. I will see everybody back tomorrow. But I'm going to leave you to it. Thanks, and See you guys soon.
See you later,
Thanks,
Rosie.
Razi.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to take over now. I'm the boss. No, not really, but I actually have a question about the settlers that I just mentioned, because it's relevant to an extent, and that is this. From what I understand, the settlers are very religious people. And Israel does have its share of religious fanatics, right? Does the fact that part of their claim to the land stems from their belief that God gave them the land, and you do have religious fanatics that will do extreme things over there, does that alter the perspective on things at all? Is that even relevant to the conversation? Morgan, sorry.
Just repeat the final bit for me.
Well, I just wonder how relevant it is. Like, I know Hamas are religious fanatics. They're lunatics, right?
Yeah.
In Al Qaeda, ISIS, Islamic Jihad, all these Hezbollah, they're all religious nuts,
Yeah.
right? And because of that, and because they are willing to kill for their religion and attack innocent people, whomever, we rightly label them as barbaric, right?
Yeah.
Now, there are Israelis, there's Jews, and not just Jews, Christians also, but for the sake of conversation, we're talking about the Jews in Israel, who believe that God gave them the land, and that's why they can have it. And as a result, they're entitled to do whatever they can to keep the land. They're irrational as well. I mean, and they're religious fanatics as well. Is that relevant to this discussion? Does it sway things even a little bit when it comes to discussing an issue where they're at war with anyone, not just Hamas, but in anybody in the area or anywhere else?
So I agree that those people exist in Israel. I don't know. So part of the problem in me answering is that I'm not sure to what extent they're present. I've seen videos, for example, of someone who is Israeli talking about how God gave us the land, and if you're lucky, we'll treat you like dogs. Talking about Palestine, like we'll enslave you, and if you're lucky, we'll let you like walk on your hands and knees. The problem is, it's a video of one guy. I don't know whether it's that one guy. I don't know if it's 100,000, a million, however many. My impression is they aren't the domineering influence on Israeli decision making. So I wouldn't think so. Whereas with Palestine, it seems much more. Again, I don't know to what extent the Palestinian population is dominated by that kind of approach. I suspect more, but certainly those kind of people are the people who are in charge, which is relevant context for why Hamas can't really be reasoned with. If it were the case that those people were in charge in Netanyahu's war cabinet, for example, and Israeli society reflected those kind of people, then I think we'd be talking about an entirely different context, and I wouldn't be voicing support for Israel so much. This would be a war between barbarians, and it's a tragedy that kids would be caught up in it, and probably a better minority faction in that case would probably exist in Israel who would be caught up in it as well. But in the current context, as it depends on how many people there are, and I'll come down on the side of saying I don't think it's relevant just because my impression is such that they aren't a domineering influence, but I could be wrong.
Thanks, Morgan. Anders, what do you think?
Yeah, let me preface this by the fact that I know very little about the settler situation.
Okay.
And I don't know what the status is of property rights in those areas. But hypothetically, again, if there is a rational system of property rights and someone, and by the way, I don't think the Palestinians in the West Bank allow Israelis to buy property there, for instance. I think it's an offense punishable by death, if I remember correctly, on the West Bank to sell your land to an Israeli. But just again, hypothetically, if I, a Palestinian, sell my land to an Israeli, I should be able to do that, right? And we register the property transaction, all that stuff. And if the Israeli is a rabid religious nut, I mean, it doesn't really matter because the property rights kind of trumps that in that situation. That's but how those dynamics play out today on the West Bank and in those settler areas, I really can't can't say.
See, the way that I look at it is if I deal with the most of the people that I would come across, we would say are mixed cases, right? Morally, they're mixed. And I try to deal with them as such. You deal with the good parts of them. I think the United States of America as a country is very mixed. I think Israel's mixed. I think Hamas is evil. I don't think there's a mixture there. But it makes me wonder, like, how much support is due to an individual or a country of mixed in a mixed case, as opposed to where somebody, like if you had a country, and there isn't one, but if there were, that's 100% rights protecting country, I would say unequivocally you throw everything you have behind that country. But there's no such countries like that, not even our own, and I just think it complicates foreign policy, and that's what I'm getting at. Morgan, do you understand? I don't know if I'm even being clear. In my head, it's clear, but oftentimes what comes out isn't.
Yeah, I mean, do you have? I think I know what you mean, because kind of people will bring up around Ukraine, for example, the idea that, well, the Ukrainian side isn't completely morally clear either, and there is legitimately a lot of problems in Ukraine, or we have done bad things in the past, and we legitimately have done bad things in the past. We legitimately have a lot of irrationality in our own culture, which is far from 100% rights respecting and so on. And therefore, that muddies the waters. That's the kind of thing you've got in mind, like when people say that kind of thing. Or, so I think if we were to exist in a world where we had a few or even one 100% basically morally consistent and clean country, and in which case we could kind of operate in such a way that countries of mixed premises got a mixed level of support from us, and they should anyway. Like we should praise them. We shouldn't ignore their faults in terms of praising them. We shouldn't block things out ever. But in the case of Ukraine, for example, Ukraine legitimately has problems, but fundamentally is, I think, the just side in the sense that they were attacked, and they're a fundamentally just society. They're like huge problems, I know, but they're fundamentally on the right path, especially in the context of them fighting Russia and Russia having attacked them. So I think that basic kind of distinction kind of allows us to side with the mixed case. And if the context were different, I think it might change things if there were more kind of morally consistent countries in the world. But since there aren't, we can't just, the good that there is that exists in mixed proportions in these countries, we can't sacrifice that because of that. So we have to kind of we need to help them prosper so that the good can thrive and hopefully eventually become the totality, if that makes sense.
I think it does. Anders, what do you think? How much support is due to a country that's a mixed case, whether it be Israel or anybody else? And what I mean by how much is it just money, maybe weaponry, food, soldiers? How much is it in our interest as the United States of America, for instance, or any country? How beneficial is it, and how much support should be lent to a country that's a mixed case?
Yeah, it's obviously a difficult question, and given the catastrophic foreign policy that the U.S. has had over the last 100 years, basically, it just gets more and more muddled with every conflict that we see around the world. But I think, as you said, we have to take it back to the basic question. I mean, what is a foreign policy for? And that is to protect the interest of Americans, to protect the individual rights of Americans. And that is the question you have to ask yourself then in every individual case. What does it make sense for us to do? And in the Ukraine case, Ukraine is a country that, until at least relatively recently, was lower down on these freedom indices that miscellaneous organizations publish, the Heritage Fraser in Canada and others. So Ukraine, compared to Russia, if there weren't a conflict, I don't know if you really could draw a line between them. Now, that being said, I personally happen to think that Russia is a threat to us and long term, and that it's a lot cheaper to fight them, to have the Ukrainians fight them than fighting them later when they're closer and direct attack. And I think the same principle applies in the Middle East. It's a lot cheaper for us, both in life and in material and money and resources in general, to have the Israelis fight this fight for us for as long as possible. But so in a way, Russia-Ukraine is less clear to me, that distinction, who should you support, than whereas in the case of Israel versus Islamic totalitarian fundamentalism, that's clear as crystal. Yeah, Israel is mixed, it has its problem, but there's such a massive difference in terms of good versus evil here. So I have no problem, say, throwing all my support behind Israel in this case. I'm more conflicted when it comes to Russia and Ukraine.
Would that include soldiers? Like, should the U.S. send military personnel to fight against Hamas or whomever else in the area?
I'm not even sure I want to venture an answer to that question, because it's not my area of specialty. I wrote an article many years ago that I called something about well, the gist of it was I was kind of speculating if we should have a voluntary force, saying so that we could drop in Marines who volunteered for a particular thing and drop them in somewhere in the world and crush a dictator or something, and that would just set a very good example for the rest of the world, and by making it voluntary, at least you don't sacrifice them for anything. They basically do it on their own. I have no idea if that is even militarily a valid or possible approach, but yeah. So I, in this case, I think there are a lot of Americans who are volunteering, actually, Israeli Americans who are back in Israel now and fighting for Israel, and I mean that's obviously a personal decision, and yeah, we have seen too much of terrible decisions of wasting American lives in the past 50 years, whereas I guess when you sign up for the military, you pledge an oath to defend the country, but I don't know that the people who did that back 20, 30 years ago envisioned what it would look like going into Iraq and going into Afghanistan, and with no clear goals in mind, and basically leaving us worse off than when we started. So it's a difficult subject.
Morgan, is there any chance in your mind that Israel will one day achieve a sense of normalcy where they're not bordered with people that are launching rockets at them and sending terrorists over? I mean, it's been 52, 75 years and they still don't have it. Is it realistic that they ever will? And if so, what is the path? And I understand I'm asking you to put on your Nostradamus hat, so you're not going to be held to the answer. I'm just curious what you think.
Yeah, we were anticipating some of what I was going to say, in that it's beyond my powers of projection to really see that. So you said on the show, I think yesterday, that you're a bit of a pessimist about this issue, and so am I, to be honest. I can't see it, because even if they were to eradicate Hamas as a threat, which I think that's very achievable, they really could do that. The other nations which surround them, even if they were to kind of establish more peaceful relations, are going to be hostile and are probably going to be trying to undermine them in other ways. So there would have to be a real kind of deep cultural change before, at least I would anticipate there would have to be some deep cultural change before you would see normalization or normalcy, something like that. In effect, if what we're looking for is the kind of change that's happened in Europe, where Germany is no longer invading its neighbors, but now Germany is very friendly with France and Poland and so on, and is an incredibly productive member of the European Union. If we're looking for that kind of relationship where the nations surrounding Israel, in effect, are Germany in that example, where they kind of become very cooperative, I find it very hard to see that. I think what was interesting, Tal Stefani was on a podcast the other day talking about the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians back in the 70s, and that it was much better, much more friendly when he was growing up. I think that's interesting, because that's, if the individual people in the countries can be more like the ideal situation, if that makes sense, if they can be more benevolent towards each other, then that suggests the seeds of hope for the situation. But given that it's descended from that, it's really hard to project. Like, for me to project when that kind of situation would be, I would have to expect at least another 50 years, if not more, like if not far longer than that. So I don't know. I really hope I'm wrong about that. I would really like in 20 years for us to come sit together and say, oh, look at, what a bastion of peace and prosperity these countries are. But I'm not convinced that would be true.
See, in my view, as far as America goes and our interactions over there, there's two things. One, either we've got to become energy independent, in which case it really doesn't matter. Not that it doesn't matter what happens to Israel. I just mean the broader Middle East. We don't have to be so involved over there if we're energy independent. But that's going to take a extreme cultural shift over here, where we're not afraid of, for instance, nuclear energy, and we're not demonizing fossil fuels. The other possibility is for there to be sort of a reformation in Islam, or an enlightenment in Islam, similar to what happened with the influence of the Reformation and the Enlightenment on Christianity. I don't see either of those two things happening anytime soon. I don't see us becoming energy independent. I know people said under Trump we were energy independent. I don't really buy it. Maybe more so, but not to the point where we just don't need the Middle Eastern oil. And as far as there being a sort of a enlightenment or reformation within Islam, I really don't see that. Anders, what do you think? Are there any other roads other than a complete transformation of philosophy in the Middle East or in worldview where Israel can actually live in peace?
Well, first, let me say that I share your pessimism about the current situation. I think it would require, speaking of Gaza, that, Israel crushes Hamas and then basically occupy Gaza for a couple of generations. And we're talking about innocent civilians. I mean, there is a lot of good and productive Palestinians who want nothing else than peace and a chance to prosper and live a good life. And just like in Japan and in Germany after World War II, it's, it can happen. I think Japan was probably more challenged than Germany. Germany was, in a way, more Western. But that same thing could hypothetically be done, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that, even having the will or the moral fortitude or the understanding of that is required. So that's and then broader in the Middle East, whether we should be there or not, and how important the energy part is. I don't know that. Given the goal of fundamentalist Islam, I'm not sure they would leave us alone, even if we were energy independent, if we just let them be over there. So again, having a presence there and Israel being our agent in the region might be a good way of protecting the individual rights and the rational self-interest of Americans.
Well, I'm happy that the three of us are so pessimistic. We've got no counterweights on the show today. Obviously, we're the three smartest on the show because we're the pessimist ones. So there is that. Okay. Any closing thoughts, Morgan, before we go?
About any particular area or just in general?
Anything in life. What the hell? Go freestyle.
Um, I would just say I think there's an awful lot. I'll revisit like a brief point that I mentioned before, which is when you look at young people who are discussing this, there's a kind of assumption around the idea that you can wage war in particularly in this area, but just in general, in a way that doesn't catch up with civilians. And I completely understand that, and I agree with the perspective that you don't want to kill civilians. That shouldn't be your goal. But it relies on this idea, like I said, that there's such a thing as a battlefield, like this clear open field where the enemies all line up over there and you shoot from afar. They all fall down.
Like it's a football game where everybody wears a uniform and you know who to tackle, right?
Yeah. Even before we had guns, wars were fought on the edge of towns, in cities. Towns and cities were besieged and sacked, and it's awful. And especially with then the advent of modern warfare that allowed planes to fly over towns and bomb them and so on, and artillery strikes. There is no such thing as a battlefield where civilians aren't involved. And that's the horrible reality of it. That's why you should be anti-war in the sense that you really don't want it, and it should be only when it's necessary. And the thing about the situation between Israel and Palestine is the situation where it becomes necessary is where force is the only option, where rationality, calm reason, discussion of multiple different perspectives can happen. That's long gone. That was gone decades ago. And some young people kind of, are understandably confused and kind of thrown into the situation where they're trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong. There is no situation where this war can happen without civilians being involved, and where war isn't what's going to happen. Like, if you delay it now, war's going to happen in a few years' time. This has got to happen at some point, and you can't get around it. And civilians are going to be involved, and it's terrible. But that you can't ignore those facts. So those would be my closing remarks.
And there's any closing remarks?
Well, yeah, to end on a somewhat positive note, and I've said this before on this show, but the fact that we're sitting here, that we're discussing these things in rational terms, that we're guided by a rational philosophy, that we have Ayn Rand to guide our lives, I mean, where would we be without that? I'm looking back, and you look at how nations and civilizations stumbled through wars, World War I, Second World War, etc., and even before that, and without that rational guidance. So we're on the right path, definitely. There are a growing number of us, even though the number is still too small. But it's a question of time, and hopefully we'll be able to win the race.
I like that you're going to leave us with a little bit of optimism going forward. That's great. Daniel, do we have any announcements that need to be made?
No announcements today.
Okay, no announcements. Well, thank everybody for joining us. And in the words of the great Mark Pellegrino, remember, check your premises.